9:59 a.m., September 11th, 2001. The South Tower has been burning for 56 minutes when the top 30 floors begin to tilt, and then the entire building drops. 10 seconds. A 110-story skyscraper reduced to a debris cloud that rolls down the canyons of Manhattan at highway speed. Within hours, engineers watching the footage called it a fire-induced progressive collapse.
And within days, someone on the internet said, no, that was a controlled demolition. The whole thing was pre-wired.
That question, fires and impact or something planted inside, has been argued in courtrooms, engineering journals, and comment sections for over 2 decades, and it has never fully gone away.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology spent 3 years on this. Over 200 technical experts. The final report on the Twin Towers came out in September 2005. Thousands of pages of structural analysis. The controlled demolition theory requires every single one of those people to have either made the same catastrophic error or to be lying.
That is a bold theory. 200 engineers, all idiots, are all in on it.
It's worth saying, some of those theorists are also engineers. Richard Gage founded Architects and Engineers for 9/11's Truth in 2006. So it's not purely laypeople versus credentialed experts. What's the actual number on their side?
Gage's group claimed a few thousand signatures over the years. But the structural and fire engineering consensus has been essentially unanimous. No major professional engineering body has endorsed the demolition hypothesis.
And that consensus is built on one specific uncomfortable engineering fact, that the conspiracy theorists actually get half right.
Exactly. Here it is. Jet fuel burning in open air reaches roughly 800 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Structural steel doesn't melt until approximately 1,500 degrees Celsius. The fires could not have melted the steel. The theorists are correct about that.
Wait, so the jet fuel can't melt steel beams, people are, right?
About that specific claim, yes. But melting is not what killed the buildings. Steel loses roughly half its structural strength at just 600 degrees Celsius. Well within what those fires achieved. You don't need to melt a column to make it fail. You just need to weaken it enough that it can't carry the load.
So the framing of melt versus not melt was always the wrong question.
To understand why the buildings came down the way they did, you need to know how they were built. The Twin Towers used what engineers call a tube frame design. The exterior walls were a dense lattice of steel columns spaced just 56 centimeters apart. And those exterior columns carried the majority of the building's load.
So the outside of the building was basically the skeleton.
Right. And then inside, a central core of 47 steel columns ran the full height of both towers. The aircraft impacts hit both systems at the same time. Outer lattice and inner core simultaneously damaged across multiple floors.
When you say damaged, how much of each system was actually severed on impact? Do we have numbers?
NIST estimated the North Tower impact severed between 31 and 36 of the 240 exterior columns on the impacted face, plus significant core column damage. But the structural damage alone wasn't what initiated collapse. The fires were the mechanism that turned survivable damage into total failure. Here is what the impact damage actually did to those columns. The planes physically knocked the fireproofing insulation off the steel. That spray-on coating was what kept the columns from softening in a fire. Once it was gone, steel that was rated to survive hours of fire exposure was now bare metal, sitting in a 500 to 700 degree inferno.
And NIST was specific. It never claimed the steel melted. Softened is the operative word. At what temperature does steel lose enough strength to fail under load?
Around 600 degrees Celsius, structural steel has lost roughly half its yield strength. The fires were well within that range on the exposed columns. You don't need liquefaction. You just need the column to stop being able to do its job.
So the fireproofing is the whole story and nobody talks about it. The plane didn't destroy the building, it just took its coat off in a blizzard.
That's actually a precise analogy.
Now here is where the timing gets interesting for the theorists. The South Tower came down at 9:59 a.m., only 56 minutes after impact. The North Tower burned for 102 minutes before it went. The South Tower was faster, and that asymmetry is one of the things that made people suspicious.
If someone planned this, why would they detonate one building almost 2 hours before the other? That's terrible choreography for a conspiracy.
The demolition theorists have an answer for that. They say the charges were triggered by the structural stress, not a central detonator. But walk me through the engineering answer, Alex. Why did the South Tower go first if it was hit second?
The South Tower's impact was lower in the building and more off-center. It hit around floors 77 to 85, versus the North Tower's impact at floors 93 to 99. A lower impact means more floors above the damage zone. More weight bearing down. The asymmetric hit also meant the load redistribution was less stable. Engineers read the 56-minute collapse not as suspiciously fast, but as structurally predictable given those conditions.
So the theorists saw speed as evidence of explosives. Engineers saw speed as evidence of worse damage. Same data, opposite interpretations.
Welcome to 2001 and every argument that followed it.
The Steelman case for controlled demolition actually has 3 distinct legs, and they're worth taking seriously before we tear them apart. First, the collapse speed. Both buildings descended at close to freefall, which theorists argue means the lower floors offered no resistance. Second, the squibs. Those puffs of smoke and debris you can see ejecting from floors well below the collapse zone in the videos. Third, the molten metal workers reported seeing orange glowing liquid in the rubble for weeks after the collapse, and there is footage of something flowing from the South Tower's upper floors before it came down.
Those 3 are genuinely the strongest version of the argument. The squibs especially, because they're visible in the video. It's not a theoretical claim.
Right. Like I watched those videos in high school. The squibs look wrong, I will say it.
They do look wrong if you're expecting a building to simply pancake. We will get into what the engineering explanation is for each of them. But the case is coherent when you lay it out that way. That's what makes this theory stick around when others don't.
Before we get to the physics of those 3, we have to talk about Building 7. Because if you're making the Steelman case, you lead with Building 7.
WTC 7, a 47-story office building that stood north of the Twin Towers. No plane hit it. Debris from the collapse of the North Tower ignited fires on at least 10 of its floors. It burned for nearly 7 hours and then came down at 5:20 p.m. in a collapse that, from certain angles on video, looks remarkably like a controlled demolition, straight down, relatively symmetrical, in about 7 seconds.
A skyscraper that wasn't hit by a plane fell down on the same day as 2 skyscrapers that were hit by planes. If you're writing a thriller, you cut that scene because it's too convenient.
NIST's 2008 report on Building 7 took 6 years to produce. They started the WTC investigation in 2002, and the Building 7 report didn't come out until August 2008. What was the actual mechanism they identified?
Thermal expansion, not fire melting anything, not catastrophic impact. A single critical floor beam on the 13th floor expanded due to heat, pushed off its support, and that local failure triggered a progressive collapse through the entire structure. NIST called it the first known case of a high-rise steel building collapsing primarily due to fire, which is itself an extraordinary engineering finding, and it's part of why the skepticism hasn't gone away.
So, Building 7 is genuinely unprecedented. Even NIST admitted that.
Unprecedented doesn't mean impossible, but I understand why it looks like a tell.
The freefall argument is where the physics gets most contested, so let's be precise. The buildings reached the ground at an estimated 200 kilometers per HR and collapsed in roughly 10 seconds. Theorists argue that for lower floors to offer no measurable resistance, they must have already been severed. Otherwise, the falling mass would have slowed noticeably as it crushed each floor.
That's actually a testable claim. What does the math say about the expected collapse time if the lower floors were intact and resisting?
NIST's answer is that once the upper block, which weighed over 500,000 tons, began moving, it was crushing the lower floors faster than those floors could absorb the kinetic energy. Each floor failure added mass and velocity to the falling section. The lower structure wasn't offering zero resistance. It just couldn't provide enough resistance to measurably slow something that massive. Progressive cascade, not free fall.
500,000 tons. I want everyone to sit with that number for a second.
The distinction the theorists make is that there is a brief period mid-collapse where the acceleration does appear to match freefall, And that's documented in the video analysis. NIST acknowledged it. How do they explain that specific window?
NIST says that window is when the uppermost section is in free motion before it fully engages the lower structure. The initiation phase rather than the full collapse. Once it engages, the resistance is there. It's just catastrophically insufficient. The key point is that the collapse initiated at the impact and fire floors from the top down, not from the base, which is what a controlled demolition requires.
Okay, before we get to squibs, the molten metal thing. Workers were describing glowing orange liquid in that rubble for weeks. That's not a rumor, that's eyewitness testimony from first responders.
It's real, and NIST was explicit. They found no evidence any fire in those towers reached temperatures high enough to melt structural steel. Not a hedge, a flat statement. Steel needs around 1500 degrees Celsius to liquefy. The fires peaked at maybe 700.
So, what was the orange liquid?
Almost certainly aluminum from the aircraft fuselages. Aluminum melts at about 660 degrees Celsius, well within what those fires produced. And under the kind of emergency lighting workers had down in that rubble, molten aluminum looks virtually identical to molten steel. Different chemistry, same glow.
So the smoking gun was just plain parts. That's somehow both reassuring and deeply sad at the same time.
It's worth noting that the aluminum explanation is mainstream materials science. It's not NIST spin. Thomas Egar at MIT was making that argument as early as December 2001, before NIST had even formally started.
Now the thermite claim. This is where the controlled demolition case got its one piece of what looked like laboratory evidence. In 2009, a chemist named Niels Harrit at the University of Copenhagen, along with co-authors, published a paper in the Open Chemical Physics journal claiming they'd found active thermitic material, specifically red-gray chips, in dust samples collected from the WTC site after the collapse.
Published in a peer-reviewed journal, Physical Evidence, named Scientist? That's actually a more serious claim than most of what we cover on this show.
Walk me through what the red-gray chips actually were, because the paper's conclusion and the follow-up analysis land in very different places.
The paper argued the chips showed an iron oxide and aluminum layered structure consistent with nanothermite, a militarized incendiary. The problem is what happened immediately after publication. The editor-in-chief of the Open Chemical Physics journal resigned specifically because of that paper, calling it a breach of peer review standards. Her name was Marie Paul-Polini. She said she wasn't consulted and that the journal wasn't qualified to evaluate the claims.
The editor quit because they published it. That is a real the call is coming from inside the house moment for peer review.
And then the U.S. Geological Survey did their own dust analysis.
USGS ran more extensive sampling of WTC dust, a broader collection than Harrit's team used, and found no evidence of thermite or explosive residue. The red-gray chips that Harrit's paper identified as nano thermite were consistent with a much more mundane explanation: primer paint. The specific primer coating used on WTC structural steel contained iron oxide and epoxy in layers that can look chemically similar to thermite under certain analyses.
To be precise about the chain of credibility there, the paper's own publisher repudiated it, the follow-up sampling contradicted it, and the alternative explanation, primer paint, doesn't require any exotic military material to have been smuggled into the buildings. That's not a close call.
So the best physical evidence for thermite turned out to be rust-colored house paint. I feel like that's a metaphor for something.
Now, the squibs. These are the most visually compelling piece of the demolition argument because you can see them in virtually every video of the collapses. Puffs of smoke and debris shooting out of windows several floors below the collapse zone, just ahead of the falling structure, if you're not thinking about physics. They look exactly like shaped charges going off.
And the engineering explanation for the squibs is what? Exactly.
Compressed air. When millions of tons of building material start falling, they generate a pressure wave moving ahead of the collapse. That wave has to go somewhere, and it finds the path of least resistance, which is through windows and ventilation openings. The debris and pulverized concrete riding that pressure wave produces exactly the puffs you see on video. Engineers who analyzed the footage found the ejection velocities were consistent with pressure waves, not detonations.
Okay, and I am playing devil's advocate here, how do they know it's a pressure wave and not a charge? Like, what's the actual distinguishing feature?
Speed and pattern. A detonation produces a supersonic pressure spike. The debris would be moving much faster, and the ejection pattern would be sharply radial. What the videos show is lower velocity, more diffuse ejections moving with the collapse front rather than ahead of it independently. That's pressure, not explosion.
There is also the sequencing. In controlled demolitions, the squib equivalent charges fire from the bottom up to drop the structure into its own footprint. In the WTC videos, the ejections track the collapse zone moving downward. They follow the falling mass, they don't proceed and create it.
All right, so verdict time. What do we actually know versus what are people still arguing about in comment sections?
Let's be precise. Confirmed. The aircraft impacts knocked fireproofing off the steel columns. That's in the NIST report, corroborated by independent structural analysis, and not seriously disputed by anyone. Confirmed. NIST never said the steel melted. The jet fuel can't melt steel argument attacks a claim NIST didn't make.
And confirmed on the collapse initiation, photographs and videos from multiple angles show both towers beginning to fail at the fire and impact floors. From the top down, not from the base upward. That directly contradicts the controlled demolition model, which requires base charge sequencing to work.
Morgan's right. Alex thinks the Building 7 case is the strongest surviving leg of the demolition argument. I think even that collapses under the thermal expansion mechanism NIST identified. Tell us in the comments which of us you think has the better read on Building 7.
Wait, I need a ruling on something before we move on. Is it confirmed or speculated that the molten metal was aluminum? Because eyewitnesses said they saw, it is real, but the aluminum explanation is also not something we can prove after the fact.
That's exactly the right question. The aluminum explanation is the consensus scientific interpretation. It fits the temperature data, it fits the materials present, and it fits the visual description. But the physical evidence that would definitively confirm it was destroyed in the collapse along with everything else. So, consensus explanation. Not forensically confirmed, that gap is real.
Which brings us to the one genuine evidentiary gap in this whole debate. And it's not nothing. The collapse destroyed virtually all physical evidence, except major steel sections and heavy mechanical equipment. Any forensic testing for explosive residue on most of the structural steel was simply impossible.
So we can't prove there weren't explosives because the evidence is gone. But we also can't prove there were because the evidence is gone. That's philosophically tidy in the worst possible way.
Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it's equally not evidence of presence. NIST was explicit. They found no corroborating evidence for controlled demolition across any of the 3 building collapses. That's the full statement. Not we couldn't check, we checked what we could and found nothing. On Building 7 specifically, confirmed that it collapsed from fire alone, no plane impact. What's speculated is what that means. NIST's thermal expansion mechanism is the engineering consensus, but it's also genuinely unprecedented. They said so themselves. A minority of structural engineers have pushed back on that mechanism in print.
To be precise, NIST's conclusion was that a single floor beam connection on the 13th floor failed due to thermal expansion, and that local failure cascaded through the entire 47. Story structure. The contestation from dissenting engineers isn't about whether fire caused it, it's about whether that specific single point mechanism is sufficient to explain a total collapse. That's a real engineering debate, not a conspiracy theory.
So the honest answer on Building 7 is fire did it. We are pretty sure how. But the how is unusual enough that smart people are still arguing about it.
And NIST was clear across all 3 collapses, one unified statement, no corroborating evidence for controlled demolition in any of them. Not WTC-1, not WTC-2, not Building 7. That covers the full scope of what was investigated.
The Herrett thermite paper deserves a clean verdict, too. Speculated. Full stop. The journal editor who resigned wasn't disputing the findings on scientific grounds initially. She resigned because the paper bypassed normal review the USGS follow, used broader dust samples and found nothing, and NIST ran specific tests for explosive residue and came up empty.
The peer review failure is real, but it cuts the wrong direction for the theorists. The system caught it. Slowly, messily, but it caught it.
What's not speculated is the evidentiary gap itself, and I want to be honest about what it means. The collapse destroyed virtually all the structural steel that would have been testable for explosive residue. NIST could examine major sections. The rest was gone. That's not spin. It's documented in their own report.
But the gap cuts both ways equally. You can't claim the missing evidence confirms demolition. That's not how evidence works. And you can't claim the absence exonerates anyone either. What you can say is that NIST tested what survived and found nothing consistent with explosives.
It's the world's most consequential. We can't know for certain.
Harry's a number that reframes this whole conversation. In 2006, 5 years after the attacks, a Scripps Howard poll found that 36% of Americans believed the government either carried out the attacks or deliberately allowed them. That's more than 1 in 3 adults.
36% is not a fringe. That's a political constituency.
That number didn't come from stupidity. I want to be clear about that, because the easy take is people who believe this are gullible. That's not what's happening.
It's coming from scale of trauma meeting inadequacy of explanation. Chaos did this, 19 hijackers, a catastrophic intelligence failure, and buildings that weren't designed for this scenario, is a genuinely unsatisfying answer for an event that rewrote American foreign policy, launched 2 wars, and killed nearly 3,000 people in under 2 hours. The human mind looks for agency proportional to consequence.
And that's not irrational. That's a documented psychological pattern. Psychologists call it proportionality bias. The bigger the event, the bigger the cause has to feel. A plot by insiders feels proportionate to the scale. 19 people and a failure to connect the dots doesn't.
Controlled demolition specifically gives you a villain. If there is a villain, there can be a trial. If there is a trial, there can be justice. Chaos doesn't go to trial.
That accountability logic is the engine of the theory. If someone planned it, the grief has a target. The buildings weren't designed to survive a fully fueled wide-body aircraft impact. That's the actual uncomfortable engineering lesson. But that lesson doesn't come with anyone to blame, and it suggests the prevention is diffuse and imperfect. The controlled demolition story replaces all of that with a single punishable act.
If you want to keep tracking this show, the evidence, the real mechanisms, the stuff that doesn't get simplified, subscribe and hit the bell. We are here every week.
Next week, Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA ran safe houses in San Francisco and New York where agents dosed civilians with LSD. People who had no idea what was happening and watched through one-way mirrors. It's real, it's documented, and it is considerably stranger than the theory.
The Twin Towers collapse is one of the most studied engineering failures in history. The investigation produced thousands of pages of structural analysis from some of the most qualified people in the field. The consensus has held for 20 years.
And the 36% number tells you something the engineering consensus alone can't answer. What do people need from an explanation of a tragedy? And what happens when the true explanation doesn't provide it?
That's the question that outlasts the physics. See you next week.
There is one more piece of this that doesn't get said enough, and it's not about the physics at all. The intelligence community received specific warnings in the summer of 2001 that Al-Qaeda was planning a major domestic attack. The August 6th presidential daily brief was titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in Us." That's not a conspiracy theory. It's a declassified document.
And the failure wasn't a single point. It was a coordination breakdown across the FBI, CIA, and SA. The 9/11's commission documented case after case, where pieces of information existed in different agencies that combined might have flagged the plot. Nobody connected them in time.
So the real conspiracy, if you want to call it that, is that the government had warning signs and fumbled them. That's documented. That's real. And somehow that got transformed into they blew up their own buildings.
That's the redirect. The legitimate grievance that institutional failure at the highest levels enabled the attack is real and documented and angering. But it's a bureaucratic failure, not a criminal plot. The controlled demolition theory takes that real anger and points it at a more satisfying but fictional target.
The theory persists because the real explanation carries a cost. It means the system failed without a villain you can convict. That's a harder thing to carry than a named conspiracy.
Next week, Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA ran safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where agents dosed civilians with LESD, people who had no idea what was happening and watched through one-way mirrors. It's real, it's documented, and it is considerably stranger than the theory.
The Twin Towers collapse is one of the most studied engineering failures in history. The investigation produced thousands of pages of structural analysis from some of the most qualified people in the field. The consensus has held for 20 years.
And the 36% number tells you something the engineering consensus alone can't answer. What do people need from an explanation of a tragedy? And what happens when the true explanation doesn't provide it?
That's the question that outlasts the physics. See you next week.